It's time to make a UI for our inventory. We have a functioning inventory. I also imported a mesh for the sword, which is part of my low poly weapons asset pack, which you can get on my Patreon or Gumroad, links down below in the description. All this specific model will also just be included with the project files that you can get as a Patreon. I also asked ChatGPT to generate me 2 icons here, one for a rock and one for a sword. They're not particularly great, but they will do for purposes of today, and that will be making an inventory screen. This is going to be split up into 3 bits. So let's make a folder here for inventory, and we're going to be making a inventory slot. Then we're going to display that inventory slot in a grid, which we can scale up and down depending on how many inventory slots we have. And then we'll make a screen that displays that grid that we can put on either like the player, or when we open up a chest, we can display that inventory. So let's get started with the first thing first here. In the user interface, we're going to make a widget blueprint, and we'll make this just a user widget, and we'll call this widget blueprint item slot. And this item slot is going to have a couple of things. First things first, we're going to add a size box here. And this size box is kind of nice because we can exactly say how large these inventory slots should be. So in our case, let's set these to 100 by 100. For a good reference, instead of making this a fill screen up here, this is going to change to desired on screen, and that's just going to make our design process a little bit easier here because it actually shows us the size and aspect ratio that we're working with. Now, the most important thing that we need here, eventually, if we want to make this interactable, which is the goal, probably not on this part, but we want to interact through using buttons here, because that's the easiest way to have interaction that supports gamepad control and also mouse and keyboard control very, very easily. In here, we're going to go into the style, and the padding for the normal and press state, we're going to set to 0 in both cases, because we're going to put things inside this to override all the stylistic looks. This is literally only there so we have an easy way to interact with our item slots. So let's put a border in here next so that we have something to work with. And this border is going to have no padding. So in the padding section for the content, we're going to set that to 0. And in the padding for the slots, we're also going to set that to 0. And then for the alignments, we're going to just make this fill the entire thing. Now you can just use a normal border if you just want these square inventory slots. What you can also do if you have a inventory slot image, we can add in an image right here right away. And this will then be our image for the inventory slots. I very quickly asked ChatGPT to generate me something. So I have an image for an inventory slot, which is honestly kind of bad. So let's select that, and now we have that as our inventory slot here. And we can actually make the border itself have an alpha value of 0. And then in the button style, we also should be able to set that alpha to 0. So our button is now just our image. And we'll make a variation on this image, which has like a stroke around it or something that we can use when we are selecting the individual slots. But again, that is for a future video. If you want to have an image like this as your inventory slot texture, what you do want to do here is you want to actually wrap that in overlay. Because borders can only have one child object, overlays can have multiple. Because we're going to need to add in yet another one of these borders here. Because we also need to have the actual item image being displayed on this thing, of course. And the way we do that, again, is we're going to make this padding for the content for the time being 0. We're going to set this to align horizontal and vertical so that it fills the entire thing. And then we're going to go back into padding here, and we set that to something like 10. So it's a little bit smaller. In this case, I might actually want to set it to like 15, so it really fits within the slot, maybe even 20. Let's go with 20, so it really does fit inside the slot. And once again, in the brush color, we can come down to the A for alpha and set that to 0, so we don't actually see anything. In there, we're going to add in another image, because this image is going to hold our, for now, let's make the default our rock texture here. And now we just got to add our quantity here, because if items can stack, we want to see how many items we have in our stack. So we can add a size box for that, or another border if you want. I like having a size box here. You can put that into the overlay as well. And here we'll be able to say, hey, our size box, I want that to be, in this case, like 10 by 10. Does that sound good? I think 10 by 10 sounds pretty good. And we want to outline that to the bottom and the right. Now, it is exactly in the bottom right now, which is less than ideal. So what we'll do is we'll set the translation to something like -10 and -10. Might be a little bit much. Let's go for -8 instead. So it's nice and in the corner here. From there, we can simply add some text into this size box, and that will first and foremost be way too large, most likely. We want to set the alignment here to being horizontal and vertical, and then the justification to being aligned in the center. And then we just play around with the size. Something like size 6 maybe, sounds good for now. You want to test this out with a sample text. It's best to use the largest number that you expect to display here for testing. So let's, for us, say that's 99. And 99 fits nicely within this box. And 0 also looks nice within this box. Now we can do a whole bunch of other things like outline settings. I can make the outline a size 1. So that we have a little bit of a black outline around our numbers to make them just a little bit more readable. But that's honestly up to what your preference, like visually, is. For 99, that still looks pretty good. Well, this is the design of our inventory slot. Now we need to make this functional. So everything that needs to potentially change is going to need to be exposed as being a variable. So that will be our text, because of course that's going to be changing when we add new items. And that will be our image, which automatically is set to being a variable. Let's also name these things a little bit better. So this will be the image icon, and this will be our text number. And then in the next part, we're also going to come back for this image over here, which already is by default set to being a variable as well. And this will be image border, because we want to swap the image that displays here when it's selected. Again, not something we're going to do today. This was the most intense part of making the inventory screen. Let's go into the graph up here, and in our event pre-construct, we just want to set a few values here. So in our text number, we want to set something, and in our text icon, we want to set something. And the thing we're going to want to set is going to be whatever is in our inventory slot. And we have made an inventory slot structure before. So let's just make a variable for that. That will be our inv slot, and that will be of type inventory slot. That's our structure that we made. And this one we want to make instance editable, because every single slot is going to have its own values there. And it's also going to be exposed on spawn. So when we spawn in one of these widgets, we can immediately set a value for it if we want to. In pre-construct, we're going to set the text number set text. And the text that we'll be using will be our inventory slot. And let's just break that open. And that will just display our stack size. Let's get rid of these little comments here because it's really annoying to deal with. And we'll hook that up into event pre-construct. Then our image icon, we will set brush from texture. And the texture that we're going to be using will be the icon that is in our item asset. So we can get icon, which is something that we defined before, and we can just set that as the texture that we're going to be using. And now if we go into our designer again and we select the root of this, we should see our inventory slot here, and we can say our stack size is something like 50, and we'll see that, I'll zoom in a little bit more, we'll see that update on the screen right here, and we can change whatever item we have. So we want to set this to a rock, now it displays a rock. We want to set this to a sword, it displays our sword, and again if we want to change this to like 80, it will display 80. So it'll just be as easy as that. If we don't have any items or the stack size is 0, we don't want to display this image and this number. So let's real quick go back into the graph here, and we'll add in a branching node, which you can do by holding down B and clicking, and we can just check has item here, and if it has an item, we do that. And if it doesn't have an item, we're going to take these and do the set visible, or set visibility rather. And we're going to set these to being hidden. And we'll do the same thing for the icon. So we just copy that over and we set the icon to hidden. Now, once this has been set to hidden, we also need to re-enable this to be set to visible when something is added to it. So we also want to add these visibility nodes to the end of our top here. And we're just going to set the new visibility here to visible and hook up our text numbers and our image icon. And now with that, we can set whatever we want in here, but as long as has item is turned off, we don't see anything. The moment we turn on has item, it shows our image and our number and whatever we want. Now, let's make this inventory slot into a inventory real quick, and this will be much faster. So we're going to make a new widget blueprint again, and in that widget blueprint, which will just be a user widget, we'll call this WBP item grid. In here we can either put in like an overlay or a size box, but really all we need here is a border. The border here is going to have a alpha of, let's say, something like 0.6, and we'll set the brush color to a dark gray kind of color, maybe even all the way down to black. Inside that border we'll put in a thing called a scroll box, and this will allow us to put in elements, and if the elements don't all fit on screen, we can scroll through so that we can still access all of those elements, which will be good for inventory, right? Because if it doesn't all fit within the box, if we have like room for 20 slots and our inventory is actually 24 slots, we can just scroll down a little bit and we can still access our entire inventory. Makes it very flexible, especially if you have a game with a upgradable inventory, that kind of stuff. This is really, really nice. And how are we going to be adding those things to here? Well, actually, there's a very easy way to do that, and that is with a wrap box. A wrap box will just add in elements to itself, and whenever they don't fit inside of the parent anymore, it will just wrap around and put them on the next line. It's actually very, very nice. Well, the design for this went a lot quicker, so let's go into the graph here. And what we'll do is we'll put in a variable here, and that will be the inventory component that this inventory grid is going to be displaying. So we'll have a reference to a inventory component that we've made, and we'll also set this to being exposed. And in our inventory component, we have our inventory array, which has all of the item slots in it. And with that, we can just put a for each loop in. So for each inventory slot, we're going to be adding, wouldn't you know it, an inventory slot. So let's do that. Going back into the designer real quick, we do want the wrap box to be a variable so that we can access it from the blueprint graph. So we can now do that with this wrap box, and we can add child to wrap box. And this will take in a widget blueprint and add it as a child there. So for that, we will need to create a widget. And when we create that widget, we're going to be creating a item slot, and that then opens up the inventory slots here as a pin, because we set that to expose on spawn. So we can simply pull through our array element into that inventory slot, and it will populate it right away. And that will then be added to our wrap box. And that is really all there is to the item grid itself. So now lastly, let's make one more user interface, and this will be our player inventory. We can also make a bunch more user blueprints here that can do inventory for different kinds of stuff that we want to display, like an inventory for a shop. We want to make a separate one that will display the inventory of the shop. The inventory for the chest should probably display the player on one side and the chest on the other side. We might get into that in the next couple of videos, but for now, let's just make a player inventory. So this will be widget blueprints, player inventory. And in here, we will finally be using the canvas panel, because we want to actually like scale this with the screen very nicely and stuff like that. And we'll use a item grid, which is what we've just made. We'll put that in here, and we will anchor this to the middle of our screen in this case. I think that makes the most sense. And we'll also then position this at 0, 0. And the alignment for this will be at 0.5, 0.5. And then we can size this however we want. So let's size this up a good bit. Something like this for the normal inventory screen. And don't forget to compile your item grid blueprint, otherwise it won't properly show up in here, but now it will. So whenever we construct this, what we want to do is we also want to have a player inventory variable in here, and that will just reference the inventory component on the player when it gets constructed. So here as well, we do expose and expose on spawn, and we'll just kind of pull that through. So on the event pre-construct, what we'll do is we'll take the item grid and we will set the inventory component that we're referencing here to whatever our player inventory component will be. So that way, whenever we construct the UI that the player is actually going to see, it will just kind of message along whatever information it needs to the actual item grid. Now, there's one last important thing. This just gets constructed once, and then if the inventory changes, it won't display any changes. So there's one more thing that we need to do, and that is make a new custom event in our item grid over here. So let's do that, custom event, and that will just be update item grid. And really all that will do is it will just execute the exact same code that pre-construct does. So if you want to be very good about this, you probably want to disconnect pre-construct, and on pre-construct we just want to update item grid, so it's a little bit easier to read. Now the one thing that we do want to actually change about this now is instead of just adding things to the wrapping box, we're going to need to clear it first, because otherwise we have like 16 items in our inventory, and then every time we update, we're going to add 16 to it. So we don't want to do that. So let's copy over the reference to our wrapper box here and just clear children every time we update it. So it will remove everything and then re-add everything with the new information on it. And going over to our third person character here, let's go into the event graph and let's just say the tab key. Let's make that an event. And when we press this, we simply flip-flop between displaying and deleting our inventory screen. Let's create the inventory screen on begin play though, so we always have a reference to it. So on begin play, what we'll do here, we'll add a create widget. The widget we'll create, of course, will be our player inventory, which will take in the player inventory component that we have here. So we can just put that through. And we'll update that to a variable. So promote that to a variable, and we'll call this inventory UI. Then back down here in the tab, we have the flip-flop for doing one thing and then the other, and then the one thing and then the other again. And you know how a flip-flop works, most likely. And all that this is going to do is it's just going to add to viewport whenever we turn it on, and it's going to remove from parent whenever we want to turn it off. And while we're at it as well, the one thing that I have been not doing at all is automatically constructing the inventory whenever the game starts. So let's do that as well. Let's do that before we create a widget, actually. That's quite important. And let's just construct the inventory with inventory constructor. And then in our player inventory screen here, we will, in the event construct itself, use our item grid, and we'll just run the update item grid when it gets constructed. So first time when it shows up, it will actually already have items populated in it. And as you can see, now that we open up our inventory, we can see our items in there. There's still going to be a little bit of an issue because when I pick up these items over here, also I enabled physics on the items because it looks a little bit better. It's not exactly picking them up. So this is where we go back into our third person blueprint, and we have our simple interaction system here. And here we check on interacted. If the interaction is finished, it could very well be that we don't have an interaction with an item here. And that might be worth checking whether or not we interact with an item or not. At the moment, we're not going to do that. I'm just going to say if our interaction is finished, for now, we just assume that that's adding an item to our inventory. What we'll do is we'll get our inventory UI. We'll get the item grid out of that, and we will update that item grid. And that we'll put into the true of this branch node. And now it should update our inventory, which we can open up. And now we add in our sword, and we can pick up some rocks, and we can see our inventory displays everything that we have. we can close it again and we can open it again and it still has everything in it because it's just displaying data that we already had built previously. So that's the basics of displaying a inventory system. Of course, this at the moment is still not interactable. We can't move items into different slots. We can't like split stacks, anything like that. That will be a little bit more advanced. We'll get into that eventually. But for now, this is how we set up the display of our inventory. So we don't need to actually go through and look at our variables to check whether or not our inventory system works. Making it interactable is the next step, because once we do that, we can start making chests and shops and everything you want to do with inventories and items. And for the full course, if you're watching this in the future, it should be all up on the YouTube channel already. But if you're watching this shortly after it was uploaded, there will be a link down below in the description to the Patreon where you can find the full course, plus a little bonus episode where we go over and change some things to make some alternative ways to interact with the inventory, which will be a Patreon exclusive episode. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page. And a special thanks to my Cave Digger tier Patreons, Sir J. Thomas,